People are losing their freaking minds over this mountain bike, and to be fair, it's a $450 Walmart bike with components we've never seen in this price range. People are calling this a game changer, including hundreds of people sending me messages. But I rode it, and I don't think it changes the game very much. Let's examine what the FS2 actually is, what it's not, and what else you might spend $450 on during a time of historically low bicycle prices. I'm Seth from Burn Peak. I've been reviewing department store bikes since before your grandma had Facebook, and this is the Ozark Trail FS2 Slalom Bike. So what's the fuss about? Why is this bike so hyped? Well, let's look at the Ozark Trail Ridge. You could call it this bike's predecessor, and it's been around for about 2 years now. The Ridge actually was a game changer. It set a new bar for department store bikes. What made it so remarkable was the attention to details that many buyers wouldn't even notice, like a tapered head tube for fork compatibility, dropper post routing, and even cable bosses on the outside of the frame for future upgrades. Not to mention that it was and still is a pretty decent mountain bike right out of the box. But most importantly, these considerations made it possible to own the bike and keep it running for many years. Compare that to the Mongoose I reviewed a decade ago, which was, in a way, a microcosm of department store bikes of the time. It was specifically designed to sell to the uninformed. These kinds of bikes wooed buyers with impressive looking features that were neither functional, rational, or serviceable even in the short term, like brake calipers you could bend with your hand or suspension that was only for styling. My criticism was never that these bikes were cheap. It was always that they could have been better, safer, and more serviceable for the same price or less. But a few years ago, Walmart's bike department went through a sort of exorcism. Apparently, everyone was fired and replaced with people who care more about bikes. And I suspected publicly that they were watching YouTube creators and probably combing Reddit. They were using our feedback to make responsible bikes for a new class of better informed buyers. And that's kind of what we were asking for all along. Since then, they made a gravel bike and even a dirt jump bike with similar design philosophies. And here, we have the FS2 Slalom Bike, which is a full suspension mountain bike that costs only $450 at the time of this video. Now, the Mongoose I reviewed was full suspension as well, but it didn't have an SR Suntour suspension fork, much less an XCM model, which has a negative spring that you can't even see. It certainly didn't have a Shimano Q's derailleur and a cassette hub. It definitely didn't have a rear through axle with boost hub spacing that matches the most common mountain bike wheels, or 180mm rotors on the front and rear. Even the rim channels appear to be tubeless compatible, not to mention it has relatively tasteful and understated styling. And the FS2 has all the upgradability of its predecessor, like those cable bosses, a tapered head tube, and a grommet for a dropper seat post. But the feature that's got everyone flipping out is the rear suspension. Unlike the ornamental linkage of old, which used bushings, this is legit with cartridge bearings and a design that sort of resembles Horst Link, although not quite. And it has a name brand coil made by Kindshock with adjustable rebound damping, which they refer to as dampening on the website, but we know what they mean. Now, this all looks really impressive for $450 because it is, but for reasons that will become clear in a moment, I wouldn't use the phrase game changer to describe the FS2 Slalom Bike. Let's start with that. Slalom Bike. Selling a slalom-specific bicycle is like selling a microwave specifically designed for reheating leftover pizza. You could make one, but most people would choose to use their existing microwave or oven. And that's what professional racers do. They set up a trail bike or even a slope-style bike for slalom. And they're kind of set up like this. A really stiff rear shock. This is an 850-pound spring, short travel, this fork is 120mm, and in many cases fast rolling tires, which this has, probably for cost. But I don't think they called this a slalom bike just because it sounds cool. I have a sneaking suspicion that they wrote slalom on it after they realized they had just created a slalom bike. If that is indeed what happened, I find it hilarious and delightfully honest. But just like you might modify a trail bike for use on a slalom course, you might want to modify this slalom bike for use on mountain bike trails. For example, this rear shock is so stiff, I can't even feel it move. Now, granted, I'm 150 pounds with all my clothing and gear on, and people have jokingly said that the buyers of these bikes must be really heavy, and that's why they use this spring. And it's true that a heavy rider on a light spring is worse than a light rider on a heavy spring in terms of damaging the bike. But why then did they choose such a lightweight spring for the fork? Suntour lets you order these any way you want, especially if you're Walmart. So I'm guessing this heavy spring actually makes the bike a better experience for most people. Yes, the shock has a damper, but it's still probably the cheapest shock in its class, and it's mated to a single pivot linkage, which isn't going to do a whole lot to isolate your pedal strokes from the suspension. If we cut through the jargon, that means that if you were to install a lighter spring on this bike, you might find it exhausting to climb with, and it might buck you over the handlebars on jumps. In my experience climbing with this bike, it actually did okay, but I could barely feel the suspension moving at all, save for the largest single impacts like sheer drops. And if you're riding a slalom course, which typically contains jumps and rollers that you need to pump and bust manuals on, that's the perfect setup. This is probably fine out of the box on a jump trail with drops and tabletops where single impacts are all the suspension encounters. But thus far, all the B-roll of me riding this bike is on single track, because to me, this looked like a trail bike. I just glossed over the word slalom as if they put it there because it sounds cool. So let's talk about my experience with the FS2 slalom bike. First of all, as of now, this bike isn't available in stores, and so I had to order it to my house and put it together. That's a good thing. If you've seen my other videos, you know that in-store assembly is a mixed bag, to put it nicely. They did include everything you need to put this bike together, which is good for beginners, and really all you need to do is bolt on the handlebars, install the pedals, slap that front wheel on, and insert the seat post. Everything else is installed at the factory, and all of that worked well enough, but a few minutes into my ride, I needed to tighten the shift cable. Especially when I'm pushing down on the cranks, I'm getting ghost shifting. So let's see if we can figure out what the issue is. Pretty obvious from a visual inspection that this derailleur cable is a little bit loose. That's normal on a new bike because the housing settles into the ends here. Putting tension on a shift cable requires no tools, and it needs to be done on most new bikes. So I don't hold this against anyone. But a few minutes later, I heard another sound coming from the rear. Noticing some weird noises back there. Oh. So you can see here, the dork disc has come loose. Or maybe I have a knife or something. The dork disc, otherwise known as a spoke guard, is there by law to keep the chain from getting wrapped up in the rear wheel and stopping the bike short. Again, spoke guards are kind of like wisdom teeth. You're born with them and then you have them removed. At this point, I was doing some pretty heavy climbing and the bike had plenty of low range. But I'd recommend pushing the seat forward a bit on its rails to get your weight closer to the center of the cranks. This bike actually doesn't climb the worst. Probably because the spring is so stiff. You don't really feel the rear linkage that much. It was around this time that I noticed just how stiff the rear suspension was. Believe it or not, but good rear suspension can actually help you climb by keeping the rear wheel planted over technical terrain. But I didn't get that feeling on the FS2. While traversing, the bike didn't really give me that full suspension feel, and when I began descending, that didn't change all that much. The suspension fork made a tremendous amount of noise and rattling, but it's a Suntour XEM30. You need to tighten these preload knobs on the top if you plan on riding anything remotely chunky. In my experience, those knobs don't actually control preload in any meaningful way, but they can keep the internals secure. Otherwise, the XEM30 is a predictable and reliable fork that's pretty easy to service. As for the rear suspension, it didn't do all that much in the way of tracking or keeping the bike planted, but it felt well put together, and that molded chainstay protector cut down on noise and damage to the rear. These are good things, but I rode the Ozark Trail Ridge, the hardtail, its predecessor, on that very same trail, and it felt like a better experience out of the box. And yes, I realize this comes with several much better components than the Ridge, but that doesn't change my subjective experience riding it. The Ridge is a significantly lighter bike, and although it has the same 120 millimeters of travel, that's kind of well suited to what the bike is designed to do. Everything on the Ridge felt appropriate out of the box. The FS2 might feel appropriate for dual slalom, or even hitting a row of tabletop jumps. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you may be starting to see why this isn't a game changer. We don't quite have a sub $500 trail bike that's ready to go out of the box. You can absolutely ride trails with it, but without a few upgrades, it's kind of like you're carrying around dead weight. Now, normally I'd go into detail and tell you exactly what all of those upgrades might be, but we all want to know about one thing, and that's the rear shock. So let's get down to the bottom line here. Could you remove this spring, not the entire shock assembly, just the spring, and install a lighter one? Sure, and it would probably feel better downhill, but honestly, you're gonna wanna replace the entire unit with an adjustable air shock with compression and rebound damping. Because once this thing starts moving, you want it to behave predictably so it doesn't buck you over the handlebars or turn easy climbs into death marches. Throwing a decent air shock on this bike would make it lighter, more adjustable, and way easier to pedal once that suspension starts doing its thing. And I think a 190 by 50 millimeter air shock would fit on this bike. It's not an exact match, but it's a popular size and it's close enough. I can't say I'm not tempted to try that with something like this. And then I'd want to upgrade the fork, and I guess I'd have to get a new headset because this one has an adapter and it's tapered head tube. And then I'd want to replace the front wheel with a through axle one, or at least the hub if you know how to lace wheels. And then I'd have to replace these tires. I'd be crazy not to. Pedals, probably want to add a dropper post. And you can see how very quickly you end up going down the rabbit hole. But that's fun. And if you remember, we upgraded the Kent Trouvaille and the Ozark Trail Ridge, and we were able to do so in a pretty cost-effective way. In the end, the total that we spent would make it a pretty good value. The math is a little bit different on the FS2. I'd say to make it a really trail-capable bike, you're probably in for about $1,200 in the end if you include the cost of the bike, and that's if you know how to lace wheels and you can replace the hub yourself. And while that probably is a great value, we're now at a time of historically low bicycle prices. You can buy a brand new Polygon Siskiyou D6 for $899, and it comes with everything, including a Dior derailleur and a dropper post out of the box. But that's not all. You can get a lot of full suspension bikes for less than $1,200 right now and save yourself all the guesswork and time. But I get it. I was the one that mentioned the benefit of incremental upgrades. You can dip your toe into mountain biking for $450 and then decide if it's right for you, making incremental upgrades along the way. And while doing that on the FS2 may be effective, you're effectively riding a heavy dual slalom bike until you do. So do I mean to say that you're better off with the Ozark Trail Ridge? That's kind of my sticking point. This bike has better wheels, a better fork, a through axle, a Shimano Q's drivetrain, and more upgrade potential for only $50 more, which on the surface is an astonishing value. But I personally had more fun riding the Ridge because out of the box, its weight and its geometry were better suited to what you might actually do with it. But the FS2 is like a puppy that hasn't grown into its paws yet. It's longer, it's slacker, it's heavier. So to effectively do what it's goading you to do, you're kind of signing up for those upgrades almost immediately, in which case you can just spend the money on something more capable immediately. But the good news is, if you're planning on riding flow trails, jump lines, and yes, dual slalom, this is kind of ready right out of the box. But it isn't a game changer. The game was already changed with its predecessor. I know that at an office in Bentonville, a team worked really hard in an attempt to make a full suspension trail bike for under $500. And then they ended up with a slalom bike. And as long as you go in knowing that, you're gonna be happy with your purchase and have a blast riding the thing. But if you're looking to race NICA or crush rock gardens, okay. you're in for some upgrades and you may be better off with a used bike or a slightly more expensive bike that has all the features right out of the box. This is far from a bad value, but right now, there's too much value to be found elsewhere to point you in this direction. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. And if you have a sick curiosity about upgrading this bike, let me know and maybe I will. Thanks for riding with me today, and I'll see you next time.